The way you should read this is that we're sitting in a circle. This is not faculty preaching, teaching, and you receiving. This is going to be a conversation. The only thing is that we kick off the conversation. And I have prepared some words, and Donald has prepared some words. I think Philip has prepared some words, and at least is willing to smile. And we are being filmed. The reason is that our students in Rome and students on work terms would like to be part of this, would like to know what's being said this evening. So the inspiration is very simple. After 9/11, the day after 9/11, I did something like this in the Architecture 142 because I felt there was a great need for people to sit and consider and speak. And it appeared that after I was done, this was the only thing that had been done in the University of Waterloo. And so I repeated that talk at other places in the university. And so it was really Leona Dobby when I basically reached out to our alumni and students and my friends also in Paris the day before yesterday to see if they were well, and Leona Dobby lives in Paris, that she recalled the talk after 9/11 and how much it had meant to her. So I thought, okay, I already was thinking about it, but this really pushed me to change, to basically make Architecture 100 into a reflection on this. So I actually asked Brad to begin this with a text that is well known to many of us, a very short text. For some of us, it's a very important text in our faith. As you maybe guessed, not that much for me, and that's why I asked him to read it, because it will come from the heart. And I will start out with a homily on one sentence in that text.
This is from the book of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 9 to 13 of the New International Version of the King James Bible. For those of you who know it, I invite you to recite it with me. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. So, let me sit down. Thanks very much. So, there's this sentence in what's called the Lord's Prayer. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And I watched today French television, and there was Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, giving a speech trying to show how hard she was, how she was even tougher than the president. And she was talking about now the world is divided in two. There's only the friends of France and the enemies of France. And everyone who's not a friend of France is an enemy of France. And she was going to close radical mosques in France. She was going to kick out the foreigners. I mean, a whole litany of things she was going to do. And of course, she does exactly what the terrorists want her to do. I think we when we have the story of the snake in paradise and Eve, we think that temptation mostly comes because it speaks to our greed. I give you something you really want to have. You disobey, you do what I want you to do because I have something beautiful for you. That's a temptation that is kind of recognizable to us. That's a temptation that we learn about when we're young, but there, of course, are other temptations. Temptation, the word tempting comes from Latin, temptare, it means test. And it means a test that is given to you, and basically that test is to see if under extraordinary circumstances you in some way will go against what you truly believe, what you think is the right thing to do. And of course, most of us know that when somebody tempts you to be angry, tempts you to hate, tempts you to envy other people, to reject them, that in some ways not the right thing. That normally we're not built like that. That we are actually, I think, not really meant to be like that. That we are made to live with each other as well as we can. And that what happened, and this has happened now over many years, and it's happened in many different shapes and forms, is that we are increasingly tempted to be fearful, tempted to hate a stranger, to turn away from our neighbor, to create fortresses around ourselves, and to abandon what is probably one of the greatest things that we together as humanity have been able to build, which is an open society. And so when I heard about the attacks in Paris, I actually reached for this book. This is my Bible at least in this situation. It's a book written by Karl Popper called The Open Society and Its Enemies. It was written in the Second World War when Karl Popper, who was a Viennese Jew, was in exile in New Zealand. He had a lectureship at Canterbury College, had been able to leave Austria just before the Nazi occupation of Austria. And he basically started with the idea that a society, an open society, which he calls a society in which we basically are called on to act like grown-ups. And to be acting as a grown-up is to actually have our own opinions, to make our own judgments, to be free but also to be responsible. That this was the incredible achievement that had been conquered against ignorance and fear and the desperate need to feel at home, to have other people carry the burden of our freedom, of our decisions. Only in very recent times, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher in the 18th century, said that the Enlightenment was that finally human beings had grown up, that they finally had started to take responsibility for their actions instead of blaming others or basically putting the decision on others. To become morally autonomous. And so Popper looked at Nazism and he saw this as an incredible throwback. He was a psychologist by training and a cabinet maker, by the way, which makes it a very interesting combination. Kind of Andrew Levitt in the 1940s. Yeah? And he wondered, why did all the Germans go with the Nazis? Why did they suddenly had turned into a people that had abandoned their neighbors, had started to hate their neighbors simply because they were other. And he described basically, he said, it's very difficult to be grown up. It's very difficult to suddenly have to be responsible. Very difficult to stand on your own feet. And many people actually want to go back to that earlier time when in some way you do not have the burden of choice. When you do not have the burden of making mistakes and having to live up to your mistakes. And so this is what this book is about. He describes the open society, which was only very recently arrived at. And he said that there are many enemies because it's only a very recent achievement. And most people still cannot cope with it. And this is why many people long to go back. So I would like to read as a contribution to a discussion a few passages. Now, interestingly, one of the great culprits in this book, and he starts apologizing for that right at the beginning, is Plato. Plato in the Republic. So let me read a few passages as food for thought. And he just wonders why the world was as damaged in 1940 as it was. The second reason for basically the trouble lies deeper, and it possibly forms the background of the first. It's based upon our fear of admitting to ourselves that the responsibility for our ethical decisions is entirely ours and cannot be shifted to anybody else, neither to God, nor to nature, nor to society, nor to history. All these ethical theories attempt to find somebody, or perhaps some argument, to take the burden from us. But we cannot shirk this responsibility. Whatever authority we may accept, it is we who accept it. We only deceive ourselves if we do not realize this simple point. So he doesn't say that you cannot find guidance in religion, or in a philosophy, or in the teachings of somebody else. But he says you have to accept that you are the person choosing it. It does not free you from your responsibility for what you do. So he talks about Plato. And he talks about Plato as he, in the Republic, describes the new world to be created. It is interesting, I think it's an important kind of discussion, both in relationship to what's happening in Europe and maybe the way we think in an architecture school. It's interesting to observe the close relationship between Plato's utter radicalism, that is to impose a tyrannical society that teaches the good, the demand for sweeping measures, and his aestheticism. The following passages are most characteristic. Plato, speaking about, quote, the philosopher who has communion with the divine, end quote, mentions first that he will be overwhelmed by the urge to realize his heavenly vision in individuals as well in the city, end quote. A city which, quote, will never know happiness unless its draftsmen are artists who have the divine as their model. Asked about the details of their draftsmanship, Plato's Socrates gives the following striking reply. They will take as their canvas a city and the characters of man, and they will first of all make their canvas clean. By no way an easy matter. But this is just the point, where they will differ from all the others. They will not start work on a city, nor an individual, nor will they draw laws unless they're given a clean canvas, or have cleaned it themselves. And Plato actually proposes, we only take the young kids, and everyone above 18 years old will be deported. Or as we call it today, liquidated, because we can only create a new society with young people. And this is then the radical proposal, he says in the Republic. And he ends then, this leads us, and Popper follows this. This leads then to the more important second point, to the irrationalism which is inherent in radicalism. In all matters we can only learn by trial and error, by making mistakes and improvements. We can never rely on inspiration, although inspirations may be most valuable as long as they can be checked by experience. Accordingly, it's not reasonable to assume that a complete reconstruction of our social world would lead at once to a workable system. Rather, we should expect that, owing to lack of experience, many mistakes would be made, which could be only eliminated by a long and laborious process of small adjustments. In other words, by that rational method of piecemeal engineering, whose application we advocate. So basically he says that even when we have a revolution, we have a beautiful plan to change the world, to create a perfect world. It still will take centuries to make it, because it can never be perfect from the beginning. So he then says Plato thus became unconsciously the pioneer of the many propagandists who often in good faith developed the technique of appealing to moral humanitarian sentiments for anti-humanitarian immoral purposes. And he achieved the somewhat surprising effect of convincing even great humanitarians, of the immorality and selfishness of their creed. I do not doubt that he succeeded in persuading himself. And the lesson which we then should learn from Plato is the exact opposite of what he tries to teach us. It's a lesson which must not be forgotten. Excellent as Plato's sociological diagnosis was, his own development proves that the therapy he recommended is worse than the evil he tried to combat. Arresting political change is not a remedy. It cannot bring happiness. We can never return to the alleged innocence and beauty of the closed society. Our dream of heaven cannot be realized on earth. Once we begin to rely upon our reason and to use our powers of criticism, once we feel the call of personal responsibility and with it, the responsibility of helping to advance knowledge, we cannot return to a state of implicit submission to tribal magic. For those who have eaten from the tree of knowledge, paradise is lost. The more we try to return to the heroic age of tribalism, the more surely do we arrive at the Inquisition, at the secret police, and at romanticized gangsterism. Beginning with the suppression of reason and truth, we must end with the most brutal and violent destruction of all that is human. There is no return to a harmonious state of nature. If we turn back, then we must go the whole way. We must return to the beasts. It's an issue which we must face squarely, hard though it may be for us to do so. If we dream of a return to our childhood, if we are tempted to rely on others and so be happy, if we shrink from the task of carrying our cross, the cross of humaneness, of reason, of responsibility, if we lose courage and flinch from the strain, then we must try to fortify ourselves with a clear understanding of the simple decision before us. We can return to the beasts, but if we wish to remain human, then there's only one way, the way into the open society. We must go on into the unknown, the uncertain and insecure, using what reason we may have to plan for both security and freedom.